Hoi! In the recent Forged in Aeternum, David talked about the ward removal, and in the context of that, he said this.
Like the ability to experiment, try different builds, like super fun. But the problem is people are so occupied with getting Banes and Wards and resilient sets for PvP, they can't enjoy the fun stuff.
Yeah.
So we want to remove this complexity and allow people to dig into the fun stuff.
At the time, he didn't directly say it, but to me it sounded like there's a good chance that we'll also see a removal of Resilient when Ward is removed, and we knew that this is going to be happening before the end of the year. Now, I have a question for you. If Resilient wasn't in the loot pool and you had to choose perks for a light armor, what would your ideal top 3 perks be that you would want on that armor? To make it a bit more generalized, let's exclude specific weapon perks that you can have on your armor. So just the general perks. The perks that I would like to have in that case would be Elemental Aversion, Freedom, and Refreshing. This gives you very high general survivability through Elemental Aversion, you get good survivability against CC through Freedom, and Refreshing is just a nice damage boost and utility boost. And here's something very interesting that I noticed. The Sandworm raid drops gear that drops at 625 gear score, and one of them is a Beast Ward set. That's very standard, but we know that Ward is going away at some point this year as well, so that doesn't really matter that much long term. But there is a secondary set from the Sandworm. And this Sandworm, in the case of the light armor here, has the same design as the other one, but drops with different perks. And these perks are Elemental Aversion, Refreshing, and Invigorated in this case. The attributes here are random, but as you notice, this is basically 2 out of 3 of the optimal perks. It does seem a bit odd that these are rewards from the highest level raid in the game, yet they seem to be rather bad for the current state of the game at least. But then, if we look at the hatchery rewards, there were original rewards that were changed because of complaints from the players. There was the Corsica Bandit set, for example, which was originally Refreshing Evasion, Physical Aversion, and Freedom. Once again, very close to the optimal perks. You have Refreshing Evasion instead of Refreshing, which is slightly worse, but definitely not the worst thing in the world. And Physical Aversion instead of Elemental Aversion. You would definitely prefer Elemental Aversion, but obviously they wouldn't want to give you best in slot from the hatchery anyways. Both of these sets were created at the same time. And sure, it could be a massive hypothetical mistake that all of these perks are just random and bad and no one really paid attention to what's going on. But in the context of everything that has been said, that seems like a bit too much of a coincidence to me. The coincidence doesn't stop there. The weapons from the Sandworm originally had different perks, and many of them were actually better than they are now, technically. And now most of them have a very similar perk combination, which especially for the melee weapons is essentially always Keen, Vicious, and a weapon perk. Again, out of context, this makes very little sense. This isn't really good for anything at the moment. But if we were to remove Bane and Ward out of the equation, then suddenly these would be a lot more effective. You would have a spear that has at least a decent 2.5 perker for any PvE content. I know some people don't really like Keen in PvE, but it's definitely not bad. It's definitely useful in raids, that's for sure. So this would be a reasonable spear to use in PvE content if there was no Bane. Additionally, this could even be interesting for PvP content, assuming that Resilient gets removed, because then suddenly Keen and Vicious would have a lot more value in PvP for all weapons. I asked about these weapons specifically for the next dev Q&A, so maybe they will give us some more hints on that topic. But now consider the following. This gear is at 625 gear score locked, and the expansion will have some form of gear score rework, reset, whatever you want to call it. Either way, our current gear will be made obsolete. So this means that these weapons here would probably not hold value at least long into the expansion, maybe in the beginning, but not at later stages at least, which would mean that they would have to be effective at the beginning of the expansion if the perks are designed with that in mind, and the same goes for the armor. Which to me indicates that Ward, Bane, and maybe also Resilient will be removed in the expansion. So far they only said it's going to be before the end of the year, but in the context of these weapons and armor pieces, it makes a lot more sense if it is exactly with the expansion. Now the hatchery gear is kind of out of the window now because that is now reserved for human Ward, so it's no longer really relevant and it's at 600 gear score anyways. But especially the armor and the weapons from Sandworm are all at 625 gear score. And I wonder if they will have special rules and maybe be treated differently in the expansion as a reward for doing the raid early. It is possible, because we don't really have any other 625 drops, that these kind of lock onto a new gear score tier and can maybe be upgraded further or something along those lines and may hold value a little bit longer. I don't imagine they will actually hold value until the end of the expansion, until you reach the new max gear score, whatever that may be, but I do think they might carry over a bit better than other gear. That's also because they are named items, and I am thinking that maybe they will take a different approach for named items from any other type of item, just because it would be kind of weird if we have to refarm all the existing named items with the same perks but with a higher gear score instead. Of course, at this point we're absolutely getting into more murky waters of the speculation regarding the expansion and how things could work, but I do believe that there is definitely potential there at least. So if you're in one of the groups that is clearing Sandworm already, then I would highly recommend keeping this named gear. Even though it may seem bad right now, I think this might be very, very useful down the road. If you haven't cleared Sandworm yet, then a guide for that will be coming on my channel soon, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when that guide comes out. It's going to make the whole raid a lot easier for you. But there's something else that's interesting about this armor and also about another armor in context of a more current event. So what I think is spicy about this armor is the fact that it has Invigorated on there. We know that the devs are working on another perk rework. They talked about that, I think, in Season 1, and were asking us what perks we'd like to see changed. And I could imagine that Invigorated is one of them. One thing that I've requested for a long time, and that other people have also requested, is that they should merge Invigorated and Vigor, so it's just a general debuff reduction for everything except crowd control effects. If they did that, that would make the perk a lot more valuable and maybe competing with Freedom depending on the exact situation as well. If they did that with this piece, then this piece would become a very interesting gear piece. It would also be a very nice early test of these combined perks to see how effective they are. I wouldn't quite see why they would otherwise put Invigorated on this piece of armor unless they specifically wanted to have one bad perk. But then as a 2-perker alone, I don't think it's the best out there. I think you could run Refreshing and Elemental Aversion with a Resilient piece, like an older piece, and it wouldn't be that much worse in comparison. And speaking of Elemental Aversion and Refreshing, think of which event came back into New World today. The Summer Medleyfaire event. Now, this event comes with patterns that have Elemental Aversion and Refreshing locked, and you can choose your attribute on them, and it's going to be 600 gear score locked. They also typically have roughly a 25% chance to roll Resilient. Resilient, Elemental Aversion, and Refreshing is not necessarily best in slot for everyone, because Refreshing isn't always that highly valued, and at the moment we need other perks like Freedom more quite often, but it's definitely a decent baseline. Now keep in mind, when you are crafting this, you aren't guaranteed to roll Resilient. You have a high chance to roll Resilient, but among other things, there's also a high chance to roll whatever the specific perk on that armor piece is, and a pretty high chance to roll Invigorated, Vigor, or Freedom. All have roughly an 8% chance on most pieces each. And if you're not getting one of them, then you are getting a weapon perk. Now, I'm not saying that you should try and roll as many as possible of these to try and get the potential future best in slot, but what I'm saying is if you're rolling them anyways for Resilient, then don't throw away the ones that don't roll Resilient because they may be more useful for you in the near future. We have no guarantee that will be coming through, and also they are dropping at 600, so you have to upgrade them with Umbral Shards. They don't have this status of being locked at 625 from the start, so they may be treated differently in the expansion. But if you start out with 625 in the expansion and they offer you a best in slot perk combination in that very moment, it can still be useful in the beginning, especially if you want to PvP. If you want to prepare even better, then get the 600 gear score patterns, but don't craft them yet. That way, if Resilient gets completely removed in the expansion, and you craft them afterwards, you will simply not even roll Resilient on them anymore. So you'll have a very good chance to get some at least decent gear from that. Now, farming patterns for the new event can be a little bit annoying. That's why tomorrow I will be releasing a guide on the new event where I explain all the different farming methods and what I found most effective in my testing. If you'd like to see that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and the Sandworm guide will probably come the day after. If you'd like to support my work further and also get some trading tips for the new event, then consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks to everyone on this list who already does exactly that. And thank you for watching. Sloth out.